The flicker of candlelight casts long shadows across a grand Victorian hall. Outside, the night is quiet, the streets empty, while inside, servants move silently, their faces weary, carrying out endless chores beneath the watchful eyes of their masters. The chill of the stone floors seeps through thin shoes, and the distant ticking of a clock marks each long, relentless hour. Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, I invite you to settle into a cosy corner of your world. Perhaps you've dimmed the lights, drawn a soft blanket around yourself, or switched on a gentle fan to hum quietly in the background. Let your body sink into the comfort of your bed, your mind slowing with each breath. If you feel like it, press that like button or subscribe just as a small nod to our quiet journey together. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what hour it is there. It's a small way we can connect softly across the world. Let your eyes grow heavy, let the outside world drift away. Tonight, we will step back in time into dim kitchens, long hallways, and endless staircases, exploring a life both fascinating and unforgiving. A world where work was relentless, nights were short, and comfort was rare. Tonight's story is about the hidden struggles, the daily toil, and the harsh realities of a life often unseen. If you were a servant in Victorian England, you wouldn't need an alarm clock. Your life itself was the alarm. Long before the sun rose, and while the grand family of the house still dreamed beneath their feather quilts, you would already be awake, stumbling through the cold, dark corridors. The day's work began before dawn, and there was nothing gentle about it. The first task was fire. Every respectable Victorian room required one, and it fell to the maids to make sure each fireplace was scraped clean of ashes, restocked with coal and wood, and lit again before the family awoke. Imagine crouching in the freezing dark, soot on your face, fingers stiff with cold, trying to coax a flame from damp kindling. If the master rose to find his room chilly, you could expect more than a sharp word. So by the time the family stirred, the rooms would already be warm, as if by magic. Of course, the magic was really the aching back of some poor maid. Meanwhile, the scullery maid, usually the youngest and lowest-ranked servant, was fighting her own morning battle. Her job was to scrub greasy pans, carry endless buckets of water from the pump, and prepare the staff's humble breakfast. A crust of bread, perhaps a smear of dripping, and tea so weak it could barely be called tea at all. The irony was almost cruel. Working in a kitchen where lavish breakfast for the family would soon appear, while the servants made do with crumbs, and yet the scullery maid had no time to complain. Her day was already mapped out in labour. The hall boys and footmen were no better off. Their early morning involved polishing boots until they gleamed, brushing suits and laying out the day's clothes. In larger households, that meant dozens of pairs of boots to shine, each one expected to look as though it had never touched the ground. Some of these boys were barely 12 years old, too young for such endless work, and yet they shuffled about bleary-eyed, cloth in hand. If you've ever felt tired before your morning coffee, imagine doing it with 50 boots waiting for you. Upstairs, the housemaids moved like ghosts. They slipped into bedrooms, pulling back curtains, shaking out rugs, tidying furniture and emptying chamber pots, all while the masters snored gently under piles of blankets. Servants had to be invisible. The family wasn't supposed to see the work being done, only the finished result. If a maid clumsily woke her mistress, she risked a scolding, or worse, dismissal. So she moved in silence, making order out of chaos, always one step behind the sleeping world. And then, of course, there was the cook. She ruled the kitchen like a general preparing for battle, barking instructions to her helpers as they chopped, peeled and stirred. The master's breakfast might include eggs, bacon, kidneys, or even kedgeree, and it all had to be ready on time, piping hot and perfectly arranged. A wrong step in the kitchen didn't just mean a spoiled meal, it meant the wrath of the cook herself, and she was often more terrifying than the master of the house. By the time the bells upstairs rang, summoning breakfast to the dining room, the servants had already worked for hours. To the family, the morning seemed effortless, their world warm, polished and orderly. But the truth was hidden, the result of countless small acts of labour, exhaustion and silence. Morning duties were the invisible backbone of the Victorian household. Without them, nothing else could run at all. If the morning had been gruelling, the day that followed was no easier. Servants in Victorian England lived in a rhythm of endless motion, one task flowing into the next, with hardly a pause in between. By the time the masters were enjoying their hearty breakfast, the servants had already worked for hours, and still the day was only just beginning. Housemaids moved quickly through the rooms like an invisible army. Floors had to be swept, rugs beaten, and every piece of furniture polished until it gleamed. Dust was the enemy, and it gathered everywhere, on mantelpieces, along stair rails, in every corner. A careless speck of dust could bring a lecture from the mistress of the house. Imagine being judged on whether or not a chair leg was shiny enough. It sounds absurd, but for Victorian servants this was serious business. Laundry was another monumental task. In an era before washing machines, clothes had to be scrubbed by hand, boiled in large copper pots, wrung out, and hung to dry. Soap was harsh, water was heavy, and the labour was endless. For a large household, this meant piles upon piles of linen, sheets, and garments to wash each week. The laundry maid often worked in rooms so hot and damp that the steam stung her eyes and left her skin raw. By the end of the day, her arms ached as if she had wrestled with the entire household's wardrobe. Meanwhile, the kitchen was a world of its own. After breakfast, the cook and her assistants immediately turned their attention to luncheon, then to afternoon tea, then to dinner. Victorian meals were grand affairs, even for families of modest wealth. That meant roasts, puddings, sauces, and pastries, all demanding precision. Servants chopped vegetables until their fingers blistered, stirred pots for hours, and carried heavy trays up and down long flights of stairs. One could almost say the kitchen never slept, only shifted from one course to the next. The footmen were equally busy, serving meals with perfect timing and posture. Their job was not just to carry food, but to do it gracefully, in silence, with the right bow at the right moment. Drop a spoon or spill a dish, and it might haunt you for weeks. At the same time, they ran errands around town, fetched deliveries, and answered the constant ringing of the master's bells. For them, life was a balance between being useful and being invisible. Even outside the house, work was waiting. The coachman cared for the horses and carriages, brushing coats, repairing harnesses, and polishing wheels. Horses had to be fed, stalls mucked out, and tack kept spotless. It was heavy, dirty work, but the family carriage had to look immaculate when it rolled through town. A muddy wheel could be seen as a personal insult to the family's reputation. By afternoon, many servants were exhausted, but the pace did not slow. The masters expected tea to be ready, rooms to remain spotless, and fires to be tended constantly. There was no after-work for a Victorian servant, only a continuous cycle of duties. And yet, amidst all this, servants sometimes found ways to laugh quietly with one another. A shared joke while carrying coal, a whispered comment about the master's peculiar habits. These small moments of humour were a way to survive the unending grind. Day-long labour in Victorian service was not just about hard work. It was about living in a world where every detail mattered, and every detail was someone else's responsibility. Servants carried the weight of elegance and order, even when their own lives were far from elegant. If the day seemed endless, the night stretched even further. For Victorian servants, the work did not stop when the sun went down. In fact, evenings were often the busiest part of all, for this was when the family entertained, dined, and expected the household to shine brightest. For the servants, it meant staying alert, standing ready, and waiting long into the night, because no one could rest until the masters had finally retired. Dinner was the great event of the evening. Preparing it had already consumed much of the day, but serving it was a performance in itself. Footmen stood like statues behind chairs, waiting for the smallest signal to move. They carried dishes with practiced grace, poured wine without spilling a drop, and whisked away plates in perfect silence. A dropped fork could feel like a thunderclap in the dining room. For a servant, such mistakes were not just embarrassing, they could cost a position. Meanwhile, the kitchen below stairs hummed with its own frantic energy. The cook barked orders as courses flowed one after another, from soups and roasts to puddings and cheese. Scullery maids scurried about with stacks of dirty dishes, their arms red from hot water, their feet sore from standing all day. For them, there was no end in sight, only the steady rhythm of pots to scrub and pans to scour. Once dinner ended, the work did not. Parlours had to be tidied, fires fed, lamps trimmed, and rooms readied for the family's leisure. If guests stayed late, which they often did, the servants remained on duty, carrying in trays of tea, fetching shawls, and standing discreetly in the background. To serve without being noticed was an art form. A servant could be present for hours in a room, yet never once be acknowledged. And still, the night was not over. The family's bedtime brought its own set of duties. Bedrooms had to be prepared, beds turned down, and hot water bottles slipped under the covers. Masters might ring their bells late into the night, summoning a servant for even the smallest need. A glass of water, a forgotten book, a fire that had burned too low. To be a servant was to be always available, always listening for that sharp metallic jingle that meant come at once. It was not unusual for servants to finally find their own beds after midnight, sometimes even later, if there had been a party. And these beds were nothing like the feather mattresses upstairs. They were often narrow, hard, and tucked away in attics or damp basements. The irony was bitter. After tending to the comfort of others all day, servants ended their nights in discomfort themselves. Yet, even in this relentless routine, moments of humour crept in. A footman might quietly mimic the pompous manner of a guest once the dining room doors closed, drawing a muffled laugh from his fellow staff. A maid, exhausted beyond words, might joke that she knew her mistress's bedtime habits better than her own. These small sparks of humour were fragile but necessary. They kept spirits alive in the long shadow of duty. For the Victorian servant, the day was not marked by hours on a clock, but by the habits of the masters. Morning began when the family still slept, and night ended only after the last bedroom door was closed. Waiting at night meant waiting for permission to rest. Permission that often came far too late. In the rigid world of Victorian service, hierarchy was everything, and at the very top of that invisible ladder stood two figures of immense authority, the butler and the housekeeper. They were not the owners of the house, of course. That honour belonged to the family upstairs, but within the world below stairs they were the generals. Every order, every schedule, and every crumb of discipline passed through them. The butler was the undisputed head of the male staff. He carried the keys to the wine cellar, oversaw the footman, and guarded the household's reputation with an almost military precision. His job was as much about performance as practicality. When he stood at the dining table pouring wine with a steady hand and a solemn expression, he was more than a servant. He was a symbol of the family's wealth and order. Some butlers became so skilled in their role that they developed reputations of their own, admired by fellow staff and feared by those beneath them. The housekeeper in turn ruled the female servants with equal authority. She was usually a woman of experience, sometimes stern, sometimes motherly, but always respected. The younger maids answered to her, and she managed everything from laundry schedules to bedroom arrangements. Her keys jingled at her waist, opening cupboards that held precious linens, expensive soaps, and the little luxuries of domestic life. To the servants, those keys were not just metal, they were symbols of control. Together, the butler and housekeeper formed a kind of partnership, a balance of power below stairs. The butler oversaw the formal side of service, the meals, the wine, the public image of the household, while the housekeeper handled the private sphere of rooms, cleaning, and daily order. In many households, the two even dined separately from the rest of the staff at a small table of their own, a sign of their elevated status. It was a strange middle ground, not family but not quite ordinary servants either. For those under their rule, life could be complicated. A housemaid might dread the sharp eye of the housekeeper who could spot a wrinkle in a bedsheet from across the room. A footman might fear the butler's silent disapproval more than the master's actual voice. Yet, these senior staff were not merely tyrants. They were also responsible for protecting their teams, smoothing over mistakes before the masters noticed, and ensuring that the endless machinery of the household kept moving. In some cases, butlers and housekeepers even became confidants to the family. They knew the master's habits, their tempers, and even their secrets. A housekeeper might be the first to know when a daughter was preparing for a secret elopement. A butler might overhear the master's private frustrations after a poor investment. In such moments, their roles blurred. They were both servants and silent witnesses to the drama of upper-class life. Still, despite their elevated position, even the butler and housekeeper were bound by service. They too worked long hours, their days filled with responsibility. Their authority came with constant vigilance, for a mistake at their level was harder to excuse. Yet among the staff, they remained figures of awe, sometimes resented, often respected, and always central. Without the butler and the housekeeper, a Victorian household could not run. They were the anchors, the disciplinarians, and the guardians of tradition. To the outside world, the family's elegance seemed effortless, but below stairs it was the butler's steady hand and the housekeeper's sharp eye that kept the grand illusion alive. If the butler and housekeeper were the generals of a great household, then the kitchen was their battlefield, and leading that charge was the cook, a figure who held almost magical power over the household's comfort. In many ways, the cook was as important as the family doctor, because without her skill, everyone from the master to the lowliest scullery maid would suffer. A Victorian cook was not simply a maker of meals. She was a craftsman, a manager, and sometimes a bit of a magician. The kitchens of large houses were demanding hot and noisy places. Meals were not simple affairs. Breakfast could include multiple courses, luncheon another spread, and dinner was often a feast of elaborate dishes that required perfect timing. Roast meats, delicate sauces, pastries, puddings, and the endless cups of tea all came through her hands. And yet cooks were often unsung heroes. Guests rarely saw them, and the masters sometimes took their work for granted. Still, in the staff hall, the cook's authority was clear. She ruled her assistants with a ladle in one hand and a sharp word in the other. Many young kitchen maids learned quickly that you did not want to anger the cook, for she had the power to make your life miserable, or at least much sweatier. Below the cook were the kitchen maids and assistants, each with their own grueling tasks. One might be responsible for peeling mountains of potatoes until her hands ached. Another might scrub heavy pots until her back felt broken. Then there was the scullery maid, often the youngest and lowest ranking of them all. Her life was a parade of dirty dishes, endless buckets of water and soap-sore fingers. If anyone in the household worked harder than the scullery maid, it would be difficult to say who. Despite the harshness, the kitchen was not always joyless. Among the clatter of pots and the smell of roasting meat, friendships formed. Kitchen assistants shared whispered jokes while kneading dough, and laughter sometimes bounced off the stone walls. Food itself had a way of brightening spirits. An extra spoonful of pudding here, a taste of sauce there, stolen moments of comfort in a long day of labour. The kitchen was also where innovation sometimes slipped in. A skilled cook might experiment with new spices, or find clever ways to stretch ingredients when the family wished to save money. In truth, many household reputations rested on their cook's reputation. A wealthy host could have the grandest ballroom and the finest carriages, but if the guests went home complaining about the soup, it was a social disaster. For this reason, some cooks enjoyed a rare kind of power. A truly gifted cook could demand higher wages, and sometimes even call the shots with the master or mistress of the house. More than one mistress of a grand home nervously avoided upsetting her cook, knowing that an ill-tempered one might accidentally serve a burned roast at the next dinner party. So, while the butler stood at the table and the housekeeper managed the household linen, it was the cook and her team who fueled the entire machine. Their work was exhausting, their hours endless, but without them there would be no feasts, no comfort, and no household pride. The kitchen was not just the heart of the home, it was the furnace that kept the grand illusion of upper-class life alive and well-fed. If the butler and housekeeper stood at the top of the servants' world, then at the very bottom were the young servants, the errand boys, hall boys, maids' apprentices, and most of all, the scullery maids. They were the invisible hands that carried the weight of the house without ever being noticed. For many, service began shockingly early. A boy of 12 might find himself as a hall boy, fetching coal, polishing boots, or running messages for every member of staff above him, which meant nearly everyone. A girl of the same age could end up as a scullery maid, trapped in the steamy, dark kitchen, her world reduced to piles of greasy dishes and heavy pans. Childhood, for these servants, ended the moment they stepped through the back door of the great house. The scullery maid, in particular, was often pitied by other servants. She rose before anyone else, sometimes at 4 a.m, to light kitchen fires and haul buckets of water. Her hands were constantly raw from scrubbing pans with sand and lye, harsh materials that left the skin cracked and bleeding. By evening, when the household was sitting down to supper, she was still bent over a mountain of plates, her face red from steam, her hair damp with sweat. Yet, in spite of the endless drudgery, there was a glimmer of hope in such work. To be a scullery maid was miserable, but it was also a foot in the door. With years of hard work, she might climb the ladder, first to kitchen maid, then cook's assistant, and perhaps one day to the cook herself, a position of real power in the servants' hall. Many of the most respected cooks had once been scullery maids who endured and proved their grit. The boys at the bottom fared no better. Hall boys and errand lads often slept on thin straw mattresses in draughty corners, sometimes even under tables in the servants' hall. Their meals were meagre, their clothing patched, and their lives a blur of running at someone else's. Command, "Boy, fetch this. Boy, clean that." Their very names seemed to vanish, replaced simply by their role. Still camaraderie sometimes bloomed among the young. They whispered secrets in corridors, shared bits of stolen bread, and dreamed aloud of a future when they might have better positions. For many, the only escape from their station was through loyalty and patience, or, occasionally, through a daring leap to another household that offered higher wages. The stark truth was that at the bottom of the hierarchy mistakes were costly. A broken plate could mean a scolding, lost wages, or even dismissal. For children who had nowhere else to go, the pressure was enormous, yet their role was essential. Without the endless scrubbing, the coal fetching, and the silent carrying of trays, the elegance enjoyed upstairs would crumble. In the grand world of servants, the scullery maids and hall boys were ghosts, rarely seen, often ignored, but utterly indispensable. Their sweat and sacrifice formed the unseen foundation of the household. Without them, the butler could not polish the family silver, the cook could not prepare grand feasts, and the masters could not live in comfort. So while the butler's dignity and the housekeeper's authority shone at the top, it was the youngest, smallest, and hardest working servants who bore the heaviest load at the bottom, keeping the grand house running, one scrubbed pan and one coal bucket at a time. If the grand dining hall was the shining stage of the household, then the basement was its engine room, hot, smoky, noisy, and always alive with movement. Down narrow staircases, often poorly lit and smelling of damp stone, lay the kitchens and workrooms where servants laboured from dawn until deep into the night. The kitchen itself was a world apart. Enormous fireplaces blazed almost constantly, with spits turning roasts the size of small farm animals. Iron pots hung heavy over coals, bubbling with stews, broths and sauces. The cook ruled here like a monarch in her own right, barking orders at the kitchen maids, tasting sauces with a practised eye, and deciding which dish would impress the masters upstairs. For her, success meant glory. Failure meant humiliation that might echo through the entire house. And while the cook commanded, the scullery maid slaved in the shadows, battling mountains of greasy pans and clouds of steam. The basement air was thick, heavy, and never quite free of smoke. Servants grew used to stinging eyes and soot clinging to their clothes. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread mingled with the tang of coal and the damp chill of stone walls. It was both mouth-watering and oppressive all at once. Beyond the kitchen lay other workrooms that kept the household running like a small factory. There was the laundry room, a steaming cavern where washerwomen bent over tubs, scrubbing linen until their arms ached. Hot irons hissed as maids pressed collars and gowns, trying not to scorch the fabric. The heat here was suffocating, but the work could not stop, not when the masters expected fresh linen daily. In another chamber the dairymaids churned butter and prepared cream, their work cool and quiet compared to the roar of the kitchen. The still room nearby smelled of herbs and drying flowers, where concoctions were brewed, tonics, preserves, and sometimes even household medicines. Every room had its rhythm, its own unending list of tasks. The basement was a maze, but also a society. Servants bustled through its passageways carrying trays, buckets and baskets. The clang of pots, the rush of water, the thud of heavy boots on stone floors. It was a soundtrack that never ceased. If the masters upstairs enjoyed elegant silence, it was because chaos was carefully contained below. Life down here was not without humour, though. Jokes and gossip were traded between chores, and sometimes stolen bites of food made their way into hungry mouths. A cook might turn a blind eye to a maid sneaking a heel of bread, as long as she kept the work moving. In these rare moments of laughter, the basement felt less like a prison and more like a hidden village under the house. Still, it was a hard life. Ventilation was poor, hours were long, and few outside the servants ever saw the labour that went on in these stone rooms. The masters might admire a golden roast or a spotless gown, but the sweat, smoke and blisters that produced them remained, invisible. The basement kitchens and workrooms were the true heart of the household, a place where noise, heat and toil never ceased. To step into them was to step behind the illusion of elegance, into the raw and unglamorous world that kept the grand life upstairs alive. The masters and their guests lived in rooms adorned with rich fabrics, polished furniture, and tapestries that kept out the draughts. The servants, however, knew a very different kind of chamber. To live in service meant living apart, tucked into corners of the house that no visitor ever saw. Most great houses had an upstairs-downstairs geography, but in truth it was more like upstairs-backstairs. Servants slept in attic garrets, basement quarters, or tiny side rooms along the cold passages. Their beds were narrow and often shared. Privacy was a luxury reserved for those who paid wages, not earned them. In the attic, beams creaked overhead, and the wind whistled through ill-fitting shutters. In winter, frost sometimes formed on the inside of the walls. Blankets were thin, and many servants went to sleep still in their work clothes, too exhausted to bother with undressing. The basement rooms, though closer to the warmth of the kitchens, brought their own discomforts. Damp stone floors, mould creeping across walls, and the constant scuttle of mice. For the higher-ranking servants, like the butler or housekeeper, quarters were slightly better. They might have a small chamber of their own, even a lock on the door. But most lived cheek by jowl with others, in a world of snores, whispered conversations, and the occasional squabble over space. Life apart also meant eating apart. While the masters dined on delicacies by candlelight, servants took their meals in the servants' hall, if the household had one, or simply in a corner of the kitchen. The food was usually plain, sometimes leftovers from upstairs, and the atmosphere was much less formal. Here, rank still mattered, senior staff at one end, the youngest scullery maids at the other, but there was room for chatter, laughter, and gossip. These meals were one of the few times when servants could let down their guard. The separation extended beyond food and sleep. Servants were expected to be invisible when not needed. They moved through back staircases and hidden doors, designed so the masters would never have to see the mechanics of their comfort. Many a young footman learned the art of slipping silently past a drawing-room door, or of waiting perfectly still, like a piece of furniture, until summoned. And yet this apartness created its own community. Servants lived among one another more closely than they lived with their families. Friendships were forged in laundry rooms, romances sparked in corridors, and quarrels erupted over trivial things like borrowing soap or shoes. For some, the household below stairs became a second family, albeit one bound by duty, hierarchy, and endless work. Living apart from the masters meant existing in a parallel world, the world of smoke, chatter, and shared struggle, just beneath the glitter of chandeliers. The servants were close enough to overhear the laughter from the dining hall, but far enough to know it was not for them. In that distance lay both hardship and a peculiar kind of solidarity. To be a servant was to belong to the house, but not of it. To live always apart, yet always essential. If the grand dining rooms of the house echoed with polished conversation, the servants' quarters hummed with something far more lively. Whispers, rumours, and tales carried on in low voices when no master's ear was near. Servants were the hidden audience to every drama that played out upstairs. They poured the wine, cleared the plates, opened the doors, and, whether they meant to or not, absorbed the secrets of the household. A careless word dropped by a visiting cousin, a heated quarrel muffled behind a door, or a letter left unguarded on a desk. All could find their way into the servants' hall by nightfall. The gossip ranged from the harmless, who wore what at last night's dinner, to the dangerous. A housemaid might whisper about a master's unpaid debts, or a footman might hint at a forbidden romance between a lady and her suitor. Everyone knew that secrets were currency, and the more one knew, the more power one held among fellow servants. Of course, discretion was expected. To repeat the wrong whisper in the wrong ear could cost a place in service, or worse. A scullery maid caught spreading scandal about her mistress might find herself dismissed by morning, and yet the thrill of gossip was hard to resist. For many servants, sharing secrets was a release, a way to reclaim some measure of control in a life otherwise bound by duty and obedience. Laughter often followed these tales. Jokes about the master's peculiar habits, snoring so loudly the dog barked, or demanding his slippers at exactly the same angle each morning, provided comic relief in lives filled with scrubbing and fetching. Even the smallest anecdote could become the stuff of long-running jokes downstairs. But gossip was not only for amusement, it was also a survival tool. New servants quickly learned whom to trust by listening carefully to what was said in whispers. Knowledge of a fellow servant's temper or a mistress's shifting moods could mean the difference between earning praise and receiving punishment. Information travelled quickly, and silence could be just as telling as speech. Sometimes, secrets were shared in confidence, late at night, when the day's work was finally done. A young maid might confess a homesickness she dared not admit to her employer. A footman might quietly reveal plans to leave and seek better wages elsewhere. These private exchanges built bonds that transformed colleagues into allies, and in some cases into lifelong friends. Of course, there were darker sides. A rumour, once loose, could wound, reputations beyond repair. Jealousy, rivalry, and ambition sometimes fueled whispers meant to harm. More than one servant's career was ended by the sly tongue of another. In that world, gossip was both comfort and weapon, amusement and danger. In the flicker of candlelight behind closed kitchen doors, servants spoke freely of things the masters would never imagine them knowing. They were the silent chroniclers of the household, their whispers carrying truths, half-truths, and imaginings alike. Upstairs, life was lived in polished phrases. Downstairs, it was the secrets and whispers that bound people together, and sometimes tore them apart. Life as a servant was built on one unshakable rule. When an order was given, it was to be carried out at once. No hesitation, no excuses, and certainly no backtalk. A master's word was not merely a request, it was law. If the mistress called for hot water, a maid hurried before the kettle had even started to steam. If the master demanded his boots, the footman ran so quickly that the laces trailed behind him. Delay was not just frowned upon, it was seen as disrespect, even rebellion. And in a world where positions were fragile, a moment's pause could mean the difference between keeping one's place or being turned out with nothing. This culture of instant obedience created a strange tension in the household. Servants often learned to anticipate commands before they were spoken. A butler might silently present the wine just as a guest raised a hand. A housemaid might slip into the drawing room with fresh logs for the fire just as the flames began to dim. The most skilled servants seemed almost invisible, present when needed, gone when not, and always ready at a heartbeat's notice. Of course, there were moments of comedy in this constant readiness. A startled scullery maid rushing to answer a bell might trip over the family's dog and arrive red-faced with her cap askew. A new footman, overeager to prove himself, might deliver a tray before the lady even finished asking for it, sending glasses rattling in his haste. These blunders drew quiet laughter downstairs, though never in the hearing of the masters. The demand for obedience was not always gentle. A sharp word, a raised eyebrow, even a cane or switch in earlier centuries, these were reminders of where authority lay. Servants quickly learned to read tone and gesture as carefully as spoken words. Sometimes a look from the mistress carried more urgency than a shouted command. This obedience extended to the smallest details. If the master wanted his chair angled just so, or his meal served in precisely the right dish, it was done without question. The order might seem absurd. Fetch me the green gloves, not the brown. But to question it would be unthinkable. The servant's role was not to reason but to act. And yet, beneath this rigid hierarchy, many servants developed quiet skills of self-preservation. A clever maid might carry out an unreasonable order with a polite nod, but share a knowing glance with her fellows once the master's back was turned. A weary cook might mutter under her breath while preparing a midnight feast, but her hands never faltered in their work. Humour softened obedience, and solidarity made it bearable. For the masters, instant obedience was a sign of order and control within their household. For the servants, it was survival. The bell rang, the voice called, the task was given, and the only acceptable answer was swift action. In the silence of the great houses behind the glitter of aristocratic life, the rhythm of service beat steady and sure. An order spoken, a servant moving, a duty fulfilled without delay. If instant obedience was the first rule of service, the second was silence. A servant's tongue was not their own. It was expected to stay quiet unless spoken to. Opinions, complaints, even simple comments about the weather were often swallowed back behind tight lips. The master's voice filled the dining hall, the mistress's instructions echoed in the corridor, and the children's chatter rang through the nursery. But the servants' voices were little more than background hum, like the clatter of pans or the sweep of a broom. For many young servants, this was the hardest lesson. A cheerful scullery maid might try to join in with the laughter of her employers, only to be met with a sharp glare. A clever footman might dare to suggest an easier way of carrying trays, but his advice would be brushed aside with irritation. The household hierarchy did not allow for equality in conversation. The masters spoke, the servants listened. Even downstairs in the servants' hall, voices were kept low. Laughter and gossip had to be measured carefully. The walls, after all, had ears. A careless remark could drift up a staircase or be carried by another servant eager to earn favour with the mistress. One loose word about a guest's habits, or a master's peculiar request, could bring sudden dismissal. Some masters preferred their servants nearly invisible. They were to glide into a room, carry out their task silently, and slip away without so much as the scrape of a shoe. For these employers, the presence of a servant's voice was almost offensive, like a violin out of tune at a concert. Yet silence did not mean thoughtlessness. Servants, deprived of the freedom to speak openly, developed sharp inner lives. They became masters of observation, reading gestures, moods, and unsaid desires. A chambermaid might know more of her mistress's moods than the mistress's own husband. A butler might sense a quarrel in the family long before a single word was raised. But this knowledge was locked tight behind closed lips. There were, of course, moments when suppression of voice led to quiet amusement. Imagine a cook enduring a pompous guest's endless praise of French recipes while she herself, an Englishwoman, had prepared the meal. Her lips pressed together in politeness, while her eyes sparkled with laughter only her kitchen girls could understand. Or a footman forced to listen to his master brag about his hunting skills, while he himself had carried the game back on aching shoulders. Silence became a hidden performance, a mask worn daily. In truth, the suppression of servants' voices served a greater purpose, maintaining the fragile illusion that the household's grandeur existed naturally without effort or friction. If the servant spoke too freely, the illusion would crack. Guests might hear of quarrels, incompetence, or scandal. Silence was not just obedience, it was protection of the household's reputation. And so, voices stayed low, opinions stayed hidden, and the walls of great houses echoed not with the thoughts of those who worked hardest within them, but with the carefully maintained quiet of service. In Victorian households, a servant's life was ruled not only by orders but also by appearances. Clothing was never casual, and behaviour was always under scrutiny. To be a servant meant to wear the correct uniform, maintain perfect posture, and move with an invisible sense of decorum, even when exhaustion weighed heavy on the body. For male staff, this usually meant stiff jackets, starched collars, and polished boots that had to shine as though they were fresh from the cobbler. Footmen carried themselves like soldiers, even when carrying trays of soup, bowing low at the right moment, and never letting a finger stray from precise service. A wrinkle in the sleeve or a scuff on a shoe could invite criticism from the butler, and indirectly from the master himself. Female servants, likewise, were bound by strict dress codes. Maids wore plain dresses, aprons and caps, which had to be clean and neat at all times. Even a slightly crooked cap could draw a rebuke from the housekeeper. Hairstyles had to be simple and restrained. Jewellery was forbidden for all but the highest-ranking ladies' maids. Every stitch, fold, and button mattered, because the staff's appearance reflected on the household's image. Behavioural codes were just as exacting as dress. Servants were taught to speak softly, walk without haste, and avoid unnecessary noise. They were to move like shadows, always present but never intrusive. Eye contact with masters was measured, conversation was limited to polite responses, and laughter was often muted. Children of the family could be playful, guests could chatter, but a servant's conduct had to remain impeccable at all times. Mistakes could have consequences. A footman failing to bow correctly, a maid speaking too loudly in a hallway, or a houseboy misplacing a dish could result in public reprimands. In some households, minor infractions led to punishment, extra chores, fines deducted from wages, or in extreme cases dismissal. Servants quickly learned that elegance and discretion were not luxuries, they were survival tools. Even during mundane tasks, the codes mattered. Sweeping a hall had to be done in precise strokes. Dusting a mantle required careful angles. Carrying a tray demanded steady hands and graceful steps. Every motion was scrutinized, and every lapse was a reminder that service was not merely work, it was performance. Yet, amid these strict rules, humour and cleverness sometimes flourished. Experienced staff might quietly correct each other's uniform mishaps in whispers, or exchange small jokes about the absurdity of bowing just so. A young maid might pretend to march like a soldier behind a stiff footman, careful not to be noticed. These small hidden acts provided relief in lives, otherwise tightly constrained. The insistence on dress and behaviour codes reinforced the invisible hierarchy of the household. Uniforms distinguished rank. Posture communicated obedience. Every glance and gesture affirmed the servant's place. To the masters, these codes ensured order and dignity. To the servants, they were a constant test of endurance, precision, and restraint. In the grand Victorian home, appearances were everything. Servants, even when exhausted or exasperated, had to move, speak, and dress as if they were part of the polished illusion above stairs. The rules were strict, but they were the invisible threads that held the world of service together, small, precise, and unyielding, much like the servants themselves. For all the hours spent scrubbing, polishing, cooking, and running errands, the rewards for Victorian servants were often astonishingly small. Money was scarce, wages were meagre, and yet the work never truly ended. It was a life of endless labour for very little financial freedom. A young footman or maid might earn just a few pounds a year, barely enough to cover the simplest necessities. Meals were provided, yes, and often a bed in the attic or basement, but luxuries were nearly impossible to afford. Clothes, shoes, and small personal items had to come out of this tiny wage, leaving servants with very little to spend on themselves. Many saved what they could, counting pennies for a new pair of shoes or a rare treat, but often the demands of life were greater than their earnings. The contrast between labour and reward was stark. A scullery maid might work from before dawn until after midnight. Her hands raw from scalding water and harsh soap, yet her pocket contained hardly more than a few coins. The cook, who held authority in the kitchen, earned slightly more, but still laboured under impossible pressure. The butler and housekeeper commanded higher pay, but with it came responsibility, stress, and constant vigilance. For everyone else, the balance was heavily weighted toward toil rather than comfort. Tips and small allowances sometimes supplemented meagre wages, but these were never guaranteed. A master might be generous one month and stingy the next. Servants became experts at navigating this unpredictability, learning to stretch each penny, barter, or share resources with fellow staff. Humour, camaraderie, and cleverness were as important to survival as scrubbing or cooking. Despite the low pay, many servants endured because employment meant stability, rare in a world where work could be hard to find. Even a meagre wage provided food, shelter, and the illusion of security. Yet the relentless demands of service meant that stability came at a high price. Long hours, rigid hierarchies, little personal freedom, and constant vigilance. Sometimes the disparity between effort and reward led to quiet rebellion. Servants might exchange tips about more lucrative households, sneak small comforts, or help one another in secret. These small acts of resistance, swapping a better shift, sharing leftover bread, covering for a colleague, became part of the hidden social life below stairs. Yet, despite hardship and exhaustion, many servants found pride in their work. They took satisfaction in a polished silver tray, a perfectly cleaned room, or a meal served flawlessly. There was a quiet dignity in the labour itself, even if the material rewards were meagre. This sense of accomplishment, however small, gave purpose to lives that were otherwise tightly controlled and strictly monitored. Meagre pay for endless work was the rule of service in Victorian England. It was a reminder that being a servant meant giving everything: time, energy, youth, and skill, while receiving little in return. And yet, through endurance, cleverness, and camaraderie, servants survived, keeping the wheels of the household turning, day after day, long into the night. Victorian servants quickly learned that the true cost of employment was far greater than the numbers on their pay slips. Even when wages arrived on time, they rarely reflected the full price of working below stairs. Hidden costs crept into every corner of daily life. wear and tear on clothing, constant exhaustion, and the forfeiture of personal freedom. Every day, a servant's uniform demanded maintenance. Starch, soap, and constant mending were rarely provided in abundance. A footman's polished boots scuffed in the rain had to be repaired with his own money. A maid's apron, stained from endless cooking or cleaning, required regular washing, often by hand. Over time, these small expenses added up, leaving a servant with only a fraction of their already meagre wages to spend on anything for themselves. Food, though provided, was not always abundant or of high quality. Servants often ate the leftovers from the family table, stale bread, cold meat, or small scraps of vegetables. Treats or comforts had to be purchased with their tiny savings. Illness or injury, another hidden cost, could be devastating. There was little room for time off, and medical care was sparse. Many servants nursed cuts, burns, or fevers in secret, afraid of falling behind or losing their place in the household. Time, too, was a hidden cost. The long hours spent scrubbing, polishing, cooking, and serving left almost no personal time. Even breaks were limited and often interrupted. A young maid might rise before dawn and sleep long after the family had retired, her day stretching across nearly every hour. Opportunities for education, social life, or family contact were rare luxuries. Youth passed by in service, often without the freedoms other children or young adults took for granted. Emotional labour was another invisible burden. Servants were expected to mask their feelings, suppress complaints, and endure rudeness from masters or guests. They smiled when scolded, curtsied when impatiently dismissed, and laughed softly at jokes, even when weary. This constant self-regulation, combined with relentless physical labour, exacted a silent toll. Even small mistakes had consequences. A dropped dish, a scalded pot, or a wrinkled tablecloth could result in punishment, or, at minimum, public embarrassment. For many, the fear of reprimand shadowed every action, adding stress to already exhausting work. These intangible costs, the strain, the worry, the ever-present vigilance, were never listed in the wage book but were felt deeply by every servant. Yet, despite these hidden costs, countless men and women accepted service as a way of life. It offered steady food, a roof, and social connections, however limited. In many cases, a servant's position was safer than wandering the streets, in search of work. Still, there was no denying that the invisible debts of labour, the sacrifices of comfort, time, and even health, were heavy, piling quietly atop already exhausting days. In Victorian households, every wage came with a price that extended far beyond money. Servants understood that the life they lived was a careful balance: toil for sustenance, obedience for security, and endurance for survival. The costs were hidden from view, but they were always real, shaping every gesture, every movement, every day of service. Life below stairs was a delicate balance of strict rules and small incentives. For Victorian servants, pay alone rarely reflected effort or skill. Instead, bonuses, rewards, and fines served as the household's invisible system of motivation and sometimes terror. Bonuses were rare, but when they came, they could lift spirits considerably. A master might reward a footman with a few extra coins for perfect service during a grand dinner. A housekeeper could give a kitchen maid a small treat for flawless work during a busy holiday. These rewards were seldom large in monetary value, but they carried weight far beyond the coin. They were marks of approval, tokens of recognition, and encouragement to maintain exacting standards. Rewards were not only financial. Sometimes a maid could gain an extra slice of cake, a footman a later bedtime, or a hall boy a short moment of rest before the next chore. These small privileges created microlights in the otherwise dim routine of service. Servants learned to cherish them, to work diligently in hopes of earning the smallest acknowledgement. In households where such gestures were frequent, morale and loyalty quietly flourished. Fines, on the other hand, were far less pleasant. A dropped plate, a scuffed floor, or an incomplete task could result in deductions from wages, or extra chores imposed as punishment. A young servant might lose a shilling for arriving late, or find herself scrubbing additional floors for a small mistake. In stricter houses, fines could escalate quickly, creating a climate of fear and hypervigilance. The system of bonuses and fines created an intense environment of accountability. Every task was performed not just for survival, but under the constant knowledge that rewards and penalties loomed. Servants learned to anticipate their master's expectations, to polish more diligently, and to move with almost mechanical precision. Success was measured not only by completion of work, but also by the subtle approval or disapproval of those above. Yet within this rigid system, cleverness sometimes provided relief. Experienced staff learned how to minimise fines or maximise rewards. A scullery maid might finish tasks quietly while the cook's attention was elsewhere. A footman could subtly impress the butler with polished silver, knowing that extra coins might follow. These little acts of ingenuity became survival skills, small victories in an otherwise tightly controlled life. The interplay of reward and punishment also shaped relationships among servants. Favouritism could spark jealousy, while shared fines could unite co-workers in mutual support. Laughter over small victories or commiseration over minor losses helped build a sense of community, even amid strict hierarchy. Ultimately, bonuses, rewards and fines reflected the paradox of servant life. Relentless labour paired with tiny joys, strict punishment paired with rare acknowledgement. They were part of the invisible scaffolding that held Victorian households together, ensuring that work was performed efficiently while maintaining the complex social order below stairs. For the servants, understanding this system was as important as knowing how to scrub a floor or polish a boot. To survive in service was to navigate these subtle rules, to work hard, endure discipline, and sometimes, if fortune allowed, enjoy the fleeting pleasure of recognition. Servants rarely enjoyed the comfort or luxury of the rooms above stairs. Instead, they were confined to the hidden spaces of the house, the basements and attics, areas designed more for utility than comfort. These quarters revealed the quiet hardships of life below stairs, far from the polished elegance of the family rooms. Basements were cold, damp, and often dark, with low ceilings and stone floors that seemed to drink heat. Here, kitchen staff, laundry maids, and other lower-ranking employees found their rooms. The air was heavy with the lingering sense of cooking, coal smoke, and wet laundry. Furnishings were sparse, often just a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a chest to store whatever meagre belongings could fit. Ventilation was poor, and the constant chill made sleep a fleeting comfort. Attic rooms, by contrast, were hot in summer and freezing in winter. The sloping ceilings trapped heat in the warmer months, but offered no protection from frost during the colder seasons. Windows were small and sometimes leaky, letting in drafts or the occasional mouse. Despite these hardships, attics were home to young apprentices, junior maids, and hall boys, those at the very bottom of the household hierarchy. Beds were narrow and often shared, with straw mattresses that flattened quickly and provided little insulation. Blankets were thin, and servants often slept in their work clothes, too tired to undress after long days. Life in these hidden rooms was not entirely bleak. Servants developed routines to make the spaces tolerable. A small lamp or candle might illuminate a corner, providing a semblance of warmth or light for personal tasks. A pair of fellow maids might whisper jokes, share scraps of food, or sneak a small treat from the kitchen, bringing rare moments of comfort into otherwise harsh quarters. Even the smallest comforts, like a well-stuffed pillow or a tiny treasured trinket, became symbols of individuality and resistance in a life otherwise dictated by orders. The isolation of basements and attics had another consequence, the development of a servant society. Here, away from the watchful eyes of masters, servants formed bonds, shared stories, and created a sense of community. Friendships, secret romances, and alliances emerged in these cramped spaces, giving life below stairs a texture that outsiders would never witness. Yet this camaraderie existed alongside strict rules. Noise had to be minimised, movements timed carefully, and privacy was scarce, as rooms were often shared. Despite the discomfort, the hidden rooms underscored a grim truth. The household could function only because someone was willing to live and sleep in such conditions. The opulence above stairs depended entirely on the labour, endurance and resilience of those sleeping below. These rooms, often ignored and rarely cleaned to perfection, were the silent backbone of domestic life. Basements and attics were more than just rooms, they were microcosms of the servant's world, harsh, demanding, yet alive with quiet ingenuity and camaraderie. Life here was a constant negotiation between survival, duty, and fleeting personal comfort. To live in these spaces was to endure, to adapt, and to maintain the invisible machinery that kept Victorian households running smoothly. For Victorian servants, the end of a long day offered little respite. Beds were hard, rooms were cramped, and comfort was scarce. Sleep was a necessity, but it came in Spartan forms, often offering only brief relief before the next day's relentless labour began. Straw mattresses were the most common bedding for lower-ranking staff. Stuffed with dried straw or hay, these mattresses flattened quickly under daily use. Lumps and prickly bits jabbed into the back, leaving servants tossing and turning to find a tolerable position. Pillows were thin or non-existent, sometimes replaced by folded cloth or a small bundle of blankets. The promise of rest was always compromised by the crude nature of the bed itself. Blankets and sheets were minimal, often reused until threadbare. In the freezing winter months, servants would layer themselves in whatever they had, wearing multiple layers of clothing to keep warm. In summer, the same bedding became hot and suffocating, offering little relief from the sweltering attic air. Comfort was a rare luxury, not part of a servant's world. The rooms themselves provided few aids to sleep. Basements were damp, with stone floors that drew heat away, and the faint echo of dripping water or shifting wood could interrupt slumber. Attics, with their sloped ceilings and thin walls, let in draughts or the occasional rat scurrying across the floorboards. Servants adapted to these conditions, developing routines and small tricks, like placing extra straw beneath the mattress or positioning themselves away from drafts, but comfort remained elusive. Privacy was another casualty of servant life. Beds were often shared, even among unrelated staff, meaning that any sleep was accompanied by the noises of others, snoring, shifting, whispered conversations or late-night preparations for the next day. Space was tight, and personal belongings were minimal, leaving no room for cosy corners or decorative touches. The sleeping quarters were purely functional, designed to house the workforce efficiently rather than comfortably. Despite these hardships, servants found ways to maintain morale. A shared joke before sleep, a whispered story, or a stolen piece of leftover bread could make the room feel slightly more human. Camaraderie softened the sting of discomfort, and friendships formed in these tight quarters often lasted long after service ended. Even in the hardest of beds, laughter and companionship provided a small measure of solace. The hard beds and few comforts reflected the hierarchy of the household. The master's rooms above were warm, spacious, and furnished with plush beds and pillows, a stark contrast to the Spartan conditions below. This separation reinforced the social order. Those who served endured hardship, while those who commanded enjoyed ease. Yet the endurance of servants was what made the comfort above possible. Without their sacrifice, the household could not function. In the end, life in these austere sleeping quarters was a lesson in resilience. Servants learned to find rest where they could, to accept the hardships imposed by duty, and to support one another through the small comforts of shared experience. Hard beds and few comforts were not just a test of physical endurance. They shaped character, camaraderie, and the quiet, unheralded strength of those who lived below stairs. For Victorian servants, the night was rarely a time of true rest. Harsh conditions, thin bedding, and freezing temperatures combined to make sleep a fragile reprieve. Cold nights were especially brutal, particularly in attics and basements, where warmth from fires barely reached and draughts whispered through ill-fitting shutters and cracks in stone walls. Young maids and footmen huddled together in narrow beds, layering every bit of clothing they had to fend off the chill. Straw mattresses offered little insulation, and thin blankets often did little more than block a draught or cover a shoulder. In the basement, damp stone floors drew away any residual warmth, leaving servants shivering even beneath layers of clothing. Nights were long, and the cold seemed to seep into the bones, making rest fleeting and uneasy. Cold alone was not the only danger. Illness ran rampant among servants, fed by exhaustion, poor nutrition, and exposure to harsh conditions. Respiratory infections, colds, and fevers were common. Even minor ailments could become debilitating when combined with the demands of constant labour. A sick servant could not simply rest. Duties awaited, and shirking them risked punishment, fines, or dismissal. Many endured illness silently, masking weakness and pressing on with their responsibilities despite aching limbs and pounding heads. The combination of cold and sickness created a ripple effect. Weakened bodies struggled with daily tasks, carrying heavy trays, scrubbing floors, or tending to fires. Fatigue made mistakes more likely, which in turn invited reprimand or fines. It was a cycle of relentless labour, vulnerability, and anxiety, where the body's limits were constantly tested. Attics, in particular, were treacherous in winter. Sloped ceilings trapped cold air near sleeping areas, and small windows let in biting wind. Servants awoke with stiff joints, numb fingers, and throats raw from dry, freezing air. In basements, moisture compounded the chill, leaving the air damp and unwelcoming. Mold and mildew sometimes thrived in these hidden corners, aggravating respiratory issues and spreading minor illnesses through the staff. Yet even in the harshest conditions, survival strategies emerged. Servants learned to share warmth, huddling together when possible. Candles, small stoves or embers from nearby fires were carefully conserved to provide brief pockets of heat. Hot drinks, even a simple broth or tea, became essential rituals before sleep. Despite discomfort and risk, these small measures helped sustain life in environments designed more for work than for living. Camaraderie also offered solace. Whispered encouragement, shared blankets, or quiet jokes helped lift spirits, reminding servants that they were not alone in enduring the cold. Bonds formed in these conditions were strong. Shared suffering created solidarity that few outside the household could understand. Cold nights and illness were a constant reminder of the harsh realities of service. They tested endurance, resilience, and the ability to carry on despite discomfort and danger. Every shiver, cough, and ache underscored the vulnerability of life below stairs, but also the quiet strength and determination that allowed servants to survive and keep the household running night after night, year after year. The kitchen was the heart of the household, but for servants it was also a place of constant labour and a sensory gauntlet. The rich aromas of roasting meat, baking bread, and simmering stews were a daily reminder of both privilege and deprivation. To the masters these smells were appetising. To the servants they were a mixture of opportunity and endurance. For lower-ranking staff, mealtime was often a quick, functional affair. Servants rarely enjoyed the elaborate dishes that graced the family table. Instead they ate what remained. Scraps, leftovers, or simpler fare prepared especially for them. Cold meat, stale bread, and thin gruel were common, often served hastily between tasks. Despite the limited menu, the smell of rich food simmering nearby could be tantalizing, and at times cruel. Kitchen smells were unavoidable. The heat of the hearth, combined with the aroma of roasting joints, frying onions, and boiling vegetables, filled every corner. Sweat, smoke, and the odour of cleaning chemicals mingled with the richer sense of food, creating a complex atmosphere that could overwhelm new servants. Experienced hands learned to navigate it, moving quickly from task to task, balancing cooking, cleaning, and the constant attention to order. Despite the hardships, meals offered a rare moment of reprieve. Servants often gathered together to eat in small corners, the so-called servants' hall, sharing what little they had. Leftovers became a shared bounty, divided carefully to ensure fairness. A slice of bread or a bit of cold meat could be treasured, and small acts of generosity, passing along a leftover pastry or a ladle of stew, helped build camaraderie in an otherwise hierarchical world. Work in the kitchen was relentless. Pots boiled over, fires needed constant attention, and the clatter of utensils never ceased. Even during meals, someone was often called away to deliver plates, clear trays, or prepare for the next course. Eating was rarely leisurely. It was another duty woven into the day, done as efficiently as possible before returning to labour. The smells themselves told stories. A faint whiff of burning hinted that a roast had been left too long. The aroma of fresh bread reminded servants of tasks completed successfully. Even unpleasant odours, boiling cabbage, scalding water, or spoiled scraps, became markers of skill, patience, and endurance. A servant who could work calmly amidst such sensory chaos demonstrated mastery of both task and temperament. Interestingly, the kitchen could also be a place of quiet humour. A spilled pot of soup, a mischievous cat stealing a morsel, or a heated debate over who would clean the drippings could lead to whispered laughter behind the cook's back. These small moments lightened the strain of long hours and reminded staff that, even amid smell and toil, life below stairs had its own rhythms and joys. Ultimately, kitchen smells and leftover meals were emblematic of the servants' world, one of hard work, scarcity and endurance, yet also of community, shared survival and resilience. Every simmering pot, every hastily eaten bite, reflected the delicate balance of labour and sustenance that kept Victorian households running smoothly, day in and day out. In a Victorian household, nothing about a servant's day was left to chance, including the timing of meals. Unlike the family upstairs, who dined according to their own schedules, servants were bound by strict meal times dictated by the rhythm of service rather than hunger. Breakfast, often hurried and simple, occurred before the household stirred fully. A scullery maid might grab a thin slice of bread and a cup of weak tea while finishing up the final touches on the kitchen fires. There was no lingering over food, no leisurely enjoyment. Each bite had to be quick, for work never paused. Pots needed stirring, floors needed sweeping, and the master's breakfast had to be ready on time. Lunch, if served, was similarly regimented. Often eaten in the servants' hall or kitchen, it was brief and functional. Hot meals were rare. More often, it consisted of leftovers or basic stews, eaten quickly between tasks. Servants learned to eat while standing or moving, as duties demanded constant attention. Conversation was subdued, laughter muted, for time and discretion were both precious commodities. Dinner, the main household event, dictated the servants' schedule more than any other. Work for the staff began long before the family gathered around the table, roasting meat, preparing vegetables, polishing silver, and setting the grand dining table. Only when the masters were seated and the meal commenced could the servants take a moment to eat, often in a corner, quickly and quietly. By the time they finished, other chores awaited, clearing the table, washing dishes, or preparing for the next day. The strictness of meal times extended beyond the food itself. Servants were expected to be present, on time, and fully attentive to the clock. Being a minute late could result in a reprimand or even a fine. Eating too slowly or chatting excessively might draw the disapproval of senior staff. The day's rhythm was a chain of tightly scheduled tasks, and meals were just another link in the endless cycle. This rigid structure created a peculiar relationship with food. Servants learned to eat efficiently, savouring what they could but never fully enjoying it. Hunger, when it arose outside these set times, had to be ignored. Snacking was discouraged, both by rules and by necessity. There was little personal money to spend on extras, and anything consumed outside the designated time was risky. Yet, within this strictness, servants found small ways to cope. Shared glances over a steaming bowl, a whispered comment about a particularly bland meal, or even secretly passing a small morsel to a fellow servant, added humanity to the routine. These small acts became part of the invisible social fabric. Below stairs, tiny rebellions that reminded them they were not machines but people. Ultimately, strict meal times exemplified the control and hierarchy that defined servant life. Every aspect of a servant's day was measured, from labour to rest to nourishment. The precision and discipline demanded by these schedules reflected the broader expectations of obedience, endurance, and efficiency that governed every moment of life below stairs. For many Victorian servants, hunger was a constant companion. Strict meal times, meagre portions, and relentless schedules often meant starting long hours of work with empty or barely filled stomachs. The first steps of the day were fueled by little more than a sip of weak tea or a thin slice of bread, and yet the labour ahead demanded energy, precision, and endurance. Morning duties were particularly brutal under these conditions. Maids hurried to polish silver, sweep floors, and light fires, while footmen prepared the breakfast for the family. Each task required concentration and strength, yet the body's energy reserves were low. The hands grew cold and stiff, muscles ached, and even the simplest chores felt heavier than they should have. Hunger was not a gentle reminder. It was a constant nagging presence that weighed on both body and mind. Despite this, servants had little choice. The household required efficiency, and lapses could result in rebuke or fines. A dropped plate, a burned stew, or a delayed tray could draw sharp words from senior staff, reinforcing the unspoken rule. Personal discomfort was irrelevant. The household's smooth functioning came first. The individual's hunger was a secondary concern. Cleverness and endurance became essential. Experienced servants learned to ration their energy carefully, moving efficiently from task to task and finding small opportunities to sustain themselves. A scrap of bread hidden in a pocket, a few leftover vegetables set aside from a shared meal, or a quick sip of water could make a difference between surviving the morning and succumbing to fatigue. The mental strain was equally significant. Hunger affected mood, patience, and concentration. Servants had to suppress complaints and maintain composure in front of masters and guests, hiding any sign of weakness. A grumbling stomach could not be acknowledged. Silence was as necessary as obedience. Camaraderie among fellow staff helped alleviate some of the discomfort. Whispered jokes, shared morsels, and quiet encouragement reminded servants that they were not alone in their struggle. Even as the day wore on, meals were often delayed or insufficient. Lunch might be a rushed bite eaten while carrying a tray or washing dishes, and dinner, though slightly more substantial, came after hours of exhausting work. The cycle of labour on empty stomachs repeated day after day, leaving servants perpetually hungry, tired, and reliant on resilience and ingenuity. Yet, amidst the hardships, a sense of pride and accomplishment persisted. To work tirelessly despite hunger was to demonstrate strength, reliability, and mastery of the demanding household hierarchy. Servants who endured these conditions successfully earned the subtle respect of peers and, occasionally, the approval of masters. Working on empty stomachs was more than a physical trial. It was a lesson in discipline, endurance, and quiet fortitude. Every step, every lifted tray, every polished surface was performed while fighting fatigue and hunger, a testament to the unspoken strength of those who sustained the elaborate, demanding world above stairs. In the world below stairs, perfection was demanded, and mistakes, even the smallest, could have devastating consequences. Victorian servants lived under constant scrutiny, where a single error could jeopardize their position, reputation, and meagre livelihood. The fear of losing work haunted every task, from polishing silver to lighting fires. A footman who tripped carrying a tray of glasses, a scullery maid who left a spot on the floor, or a kitchen maid who slightly overcooked a roast risked punishment or dismissal. Supervisors and housekeepers were strict, and masters were often unforgiving. Even minor lapses were not brushed aside as part of learning. They were seen as a failure of attention, diligence, or respect for the household hierarchy. The consequences of mistakes went beyond immediate rebuke. Servants could face fines deducted from already meagre wages, extra chores assigned as punishment, or, in severe cases, outright dismissal. For young apprentices and newly hired staff, this fear was magnified. A misstep in their first week could mean losing the position that provided shelter, food, and social stability. The pressure to perform flawlessly was immense, leaving little room for human error. Mistakes also carried social repercussions among staff. Word of an error could travel quickly through the servant network, affecting trust and relationships. Peers might question reliability, or become resentful if someone's lapse increased the workload for others. In this tightly knit yet hierarchical environment, the smallest slip could ripple through both the household and the servant community. Surviving in this environment required a combination of skill, attention to detail, and cunning. Experienced servants developed strategies to minimize mistakes, double-checking work, anticipating the needs of masters, and observing the reactions of supervisors closely. Quick thinking, calm under pressure, and the ability to correct errors discreetly often separated those who survived from those who were dismissed. Yet, the fear of losing work also shaped the daily rhythm of life. Servants moved with heightened awareness, eyes scanning for obstacles, hands steady, movements deliberate. Exhaustion from long hours combined with hunger, illness, or harsh conditions increased the risk of mistakes. The constant pressure created tension, but it also forged resilience, teaching servants to endure stress while maintaining performance. Some minor mistakes, however, became sources of quiet humour among staff. A dropped dish that only slightly cracked, a spilled sauce, or a comical misstep could lead to whispered jokes once the master's gaze had moved on. These small moments of levity helped balance the relentless seriousness of the work and reinforced bonds among fellow servants. Ultimately, the risk of losing work over small mistakes was a defining feature of Victorian service. It demanded vigilance, endurance, and skill in every gesture, every chore, every step. For servants, survival was not just about completing tasks. It was about navigating a world where one slip could undo months or years of hard-earned security. Every day was a careful exercise in precision, discipline, and quiet resilience, a testament to the relentless demands of life below stairs. Life as a Victorian servant was never truly secure. Even those who had served faithfully for years could find themselves abruptly out of work. Sudden unemployment was a stark reality, brought on by a change in household circumstances, a master's whim, or mistakes that, while small, were deemed unforgivable. For many it was a frightening and disorienting upheaval. The reasons were varied. A household might downsize after a financial loss, reducing staff numbers overnight. A new master or mistress might arrive with different expectations, preferring to replace long-standing staff with people more suited to their particular tastes. Even illness, fatigue, or temporary inability to perform duties could result in dismissal, leaving a servant without income, shelter, or stability. The consequences of losing work were immediate and severe. Servants relied on their employment not only for wages but for the roof over their heads and the meals provided. Suddenly finding oneself without these essentials was a personal crisis. Young workers, apprentices, and those with families to support faced particularly stark challenges. Often, leaving one household meant searching quickly for another, navigating a world where available positions were scarce, competition was fierce, and references or reputation could make the difference between employment and destitution. Adjustment to change was never easy. A new position meant learning unfamiliar routines, adhering to different hierarchies, and mastering the exacting standards of new masters. Each household had its own rules, from meal times to dress codes, and the servant who failed to adapt quickly risked being dismissed again. The pressure to perform flawlessly in an unfamiliar environment added stress, fatigue, and anxiety to lives already governed by strict schedules. Beyond the practical challenges, sudden unemployment carried emotional weight. Servants often felt shame, disappointment, or fear, especially when dismissed publicly or for trivial reasons. The abrupt loss of community, the fellow staff members with whom they had shared hardships, jokes, and small triumphs, left gaps in both social and emotional life. The constant movement from household to household disrupted relationships, routine, and for many, a sense of identity tied to their work. Yet, resilience often prevailed. Experienced servants developed networks, learning about vacancies, gathering references, and helping one another find new placements. Some took temporary work in smaller households or as day labourers until a more permanent position arose. The uncertainty became a skill to navigate, reading situations carefully, anticipating changes, and maintaining a reputation that could open doors elsewhere. Change, while harsh, also offered opportunities. A move to a better household could mean improved conditions, slightly higher wages, or the chance to rise in rank. Adaptability, quick learning, and discretion were essential survival traits. Servants who could endure the shock of sudden unemployment and navigate the uncertainties of new work displayed remarkable resourcefulness and perseverance. In the world below stairs, nothing was permanent. Employment, stability, and routine were fragile, easily disrupted by circumstance or the whims of masters. Sudden unemployment and change were constant reminders of life's precariousness, yet they also highlighted the resilience, adaptability, and quiet determination of those who continued to serve, day after day, house after house, year after year. For a Victorian servant, losing a position was only the first hurdle. The next, and often more grueling challenge, was finding new service. Employment below stairs was competitive, unpredictable, and shaped by the unspoken networks of references, reputation, and timing. Securing a new household position could take days, weeks, or even months, leaving the unemployed in a precarious state. Young apprentices or new entrants to service faced the steepest climb. Without experience or a reliable reference, they were at the mercy of employers' whims. Even skilled servants sometimes struggled, as positions depended on openings that rarely coincided with their availability. Rumours of vacancies circulated among the servant community, but information travelled slowly and was often fragmented. Those without connections or insider knowledge were left searching in uncertainty. The process of securing a new role demanded strategy. A prospective servant might visit multiple households, present themselves in proper attire, and speak with poise and humility. References mattered enormously. A recommendation from a respected former master or housekeeper could open doors. A poor reputation could close them just as quickly. Servants learned to present themselves as reliable, discreet, and competent, knowing that first impressions could determine their livelihood. The competition was not just about skill, it was about timing and endurance. Multiple applicants might vie for a single position, and even an experienced worker could be passed over if another candidate arrived slightly earlier or offered to start immediately. Walking the streets, knocking on doors and visiting employment agencies, places that advertised domestic vacancies, were part of the routine, often exhausting and emotionally draining. The constant uncertainty weighed heavily, compounding the anxiety of recent dismissal. Financial pressure added to the stress. Without wages, servants had little money for food, lodging or transportation. Many relied on temporary shelters or the kindness of acquaintances to survive while seeking work. Those with families faced even more urgent pressures, balancing the needs of children or dependents with the necessity of securing income quickly. Every passing day without employment intensified the struggle, testing resilience and resourcefulness. Yet, within this struggle, communities of servants offered quiet support. Experienced staff provided advice, suggested positions, or even helped newcomers obtain introductions to reputable households. Camaraderie and shared knowledge became lifelines, turning what could be a lonely and desperate search into a networked effort. Humour, small victories, and shared stories of success kept spirits afloat amidst uncertainty. Finding new service was more than just securing employment. It was a test of adaptability, perseverance, and social skill. Those who succeeded demonstrated not only competence, but the ability to navigate a complex system of expectations, hierarchies, and social rules. Each new position offered hope, but also a reminder of the fragile nature of life below stairs. In the end, the struggle to find new service was emblematic of the Victorian servants' world, precarious, demanding, and ever uncertain. Yet it was also a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring determination of those who lived and worked below stairs, navigating a system that left little room for error and even less for rest. Life below stairs was defined by labour, and that labour was relentless. For Victorian servants, long hours were not merely a challenge, they were a defining feature of existence. Days often stretched from before dawn until after the household had gone to bed, leaving little time for rest, personal care, or leisure. Over time, these extended hours took a profound toll on both body and mind. Physically, the consequences were immediate. Footmen carried heavy trays, housemaids scrubbed floors and dusted furniture, and kitchen staff lifted pots, stirred fires, and chopped ingredients for hours on end. Fatigue set in early, but there was little room to slow down. Muscles ached, joints stiffened, and blisters or bruises were common. Even minor injuries became obstacles to productivity, as the pace of work allowed no margin for recovery. Servants pushed through pain, knowing that any lapse could result in fines, reprimand, or dismissal. Mental strain accompanied the physical exhaustion. Continuous work demanded unwavering attention to detail. A single slip, a scuffed floor, a burned meal, or a mislaid item could have serious consequences. Constant vigilance, combined with the need to anticipate the family's needs, created a state of perpetual tension. Over time, fatigue impaired concentration, yet the work could not be paused, creating a cycle of stress and diminished performance. Long hours also affected personal life and social bonds. Servants had little time for family, friendships outside the household, or leisure activities. Meals were rushed, sleep was brief, and moments of relaxation were scarce. Young apprentices grew up in a world defined by work, their formative years shaped by routine and hierarchy rather than choice or freedom. Emotional exhaustion was common. Morale ebbed under the relentless demands of the household. Despite the harshness, camaraderie among staff helped mitigate some effects. Sharing tasks, offering quiet encouragement, or lending a hand with particularly arduous chores created bonds that could sustain morale. Humour, whispered stories, and small victories became critical tools for maintaining resilience in a world dominated by labour. Even brief moments of shared laughter helped relieve the pressure of ceaseless work. Health suffered as well. Poor nutrition, long hours, and exposure to heat, smoke, or damp conditions weakened immunity, making servants vulnerable to illness. Fatigue compounded the effects of minor ailments, slowing recovery and increasing the risk of accidents. The body was pushed to its limits, often in silence, as the demands of service were relentless and unforgiving. Yet, endurance and perseverance became defining traits. Servants developed remarkable stamina, learning to pace themselves, anticipate the household's needs, and complete tasks efficiently despite exhaustion. Long hours were a test of discipline, resilience, and adaptability, and surviving them was a mark of competence and reliability. In the world below stairs, long hours shaped every aspect of life. They taxed the body, strained the mind, and limited personal freedom, yet they also forged strength, skill, and a deep understanding of the demands of service. The relentless rhythm of work defined the servant's existence, leaving little room for error, rest, or personal indulgence. But it also revealed the quiet endurance and resilience that sustained Victorian households day after day. Life below stairs was not only exhausting, it was often dangerous. Victorian servants faced constant risk of physical injuries and accidents, a reality born from the combination of heavy labour, long hours, and the strict pace demanded by the household hierarchy. A single moment of carelessness or fatigue could result in bruises, burns, or worse, and there was little room for recovery. Kitchens were particularly hazardous. Boiling water, open fires, and sharp knives were part of the daily routine. A scald from a hot pot, a cut from a cleaver, or a fall on a wet floor could incapacitate a servant temporarily or even permanently. Footmen balancing trays of silver and glasses faced the risk of drops and broken items, but also the danger of personal injury if the load toppled. In the laundry, large tubs of water, heavy wet linens and hot irons created further hazards, leaving staff vulnerable to burns, sprains and exhaustion-induced accidents. Accidents often occurred silently, with no one to intervene. Servants were expected to continue their duties despite injury, and reporting an accident could sometimes be seen as weakness or incompetence. Minor injuries were patched up as best as possible, and the work continued, often worsening the problem. This culture of endurance reinforced the relentless pace and contributed to a high incidence of chronic pain among lower-ranking staff. Even beyond the obvious dangers, the design of the house itself posed risks. Narrow staircases, polished floors, and cluttered work areas increased the likelihood of slips, trips, and falls. Heavy doors could trap fingers, and poorly lit corridors made navigation treacherous. Staff moving quickly between tasks or carrying loads had to maintain constant awareness, but fatigue and distraction could turn routine movements into accidents. Some accidents were public and humiliating. A spilled tray of glasses or a dropped dish not only damaged property, but drew the ire of supervisors and masters alike. Punishments, fines, or extra labour often followed, creating a double burden. Physical pain compounded by social and financial repercussions. For young or inexperienced servants, these incidents could be especially demoralising, reinforcing the strict discipline demanded below stairs. Despite the hazards, ingenuity and caution helped mitigate risks. Servants developed habits to prevent injury, careful lifting techniques, double-checking steps on stairs, and planning movements around the house to avoid collisions or spills. Experienced staff often guided newcomers, teaching them how to navigate dangerous spaces and anticipate potential accidents. These lessons, passed quietly from one generation of servants to the next, were essential for survival. The prevalence of injuries also strengthened bonds among staff. Sharing remedies, offering assistance, or simply providing sympathy created a sense of solidarity. Humour and whispered jokes about minor accidents helped relieve tension and maintain morale even in the face of pain and exhaustion. Physical injuries and accidents were an inescapable part of life below stairs. They reflected the dangers of relentless labour, the unforgiving household environment, and the necessity of endurance. For Victorian servants, survival meant mastering both the tasks at hand and the constant risks surrounding them, a delicate balance of vigilance, skill, and resilience that defined every day of service. For Victorian servants, food was often functional rather than nourishing. The diet provided was dictated more by economy than by health, and it rarely offered the calories or nutrients necessary to sustain long hours of labour. This poor diet, combined with exhaustion, damp conditions, and constant exposure to hazards, made sickness a common and persistent threat. Meals for lower-ranking staff were modest and repetitive. Breakfast might consist of bread and weak tea, lunch often leftovers or simple stews, and dinner little more than thin porridge or cold meat. Fresh vegetables were rare, and fruit was considered a luxury. Protein, fats, and essential vitamins were limited, leaving the body underfueled and vulnerable to illness. Hunger was a constant companion, and meals were hurried, eaten in corners or while standing, leaving little time for enjoyment or proper digestion. The effects of poor diet were compounded by the physically demanding nature of servant work. Long hours, heavy lifting, and constant motion required substantial energy. Without adequate nourishment, fatigue set in more quickly, concentration faltered, and the risk of accidents increased. Minor ailments, headaches, stomach aches, or joint pain were common, and could escalate into more serious conditions if not managed carefully. Illness spread easily in the close quarters where servants lived and worked. Basements and attics were often damp and poorly ventilated, creating fertile ground for respiratory problems. Fever, colds, and coughs passed quickly from one worker to another, and the constant exposure to heat, smoke, or soiled materials further weakened immunity. A sick servant could rarely rest, as duties demanded attention regardless of personal discomfort. Recovery was slow, and returning to full strength was often impossible before fatigue set in again. The consequences of sickness went beyond the physical. Being unwell often meant falling behind in duties, which could lead to fines, reprimands, or even dismissal. The mental strain of working while ill compounded the problem as servants struggled to meet expectations despite their weakened state. The hierarchy of the household left little room for compassion. Illness was a personal burden to bear quietly. Despite these challenges, servants developed strategies to cope. Small measures, like drinking hot tea, taking brief moments to rest, or sharing scraps of nutritious food, helped stave off weakness. Camaraderie among staff provided support. Experienced servants offered advice, remedies, or moral encouragement to those suffering. These small acts of care and solidarity were essential for survival in an environment that offered little external help. Poor diet and sickness were intertwined with every aspect of servant life. They reflected the vulnerability imposed by long hours, inadequate nourishment, and harsh living conditions. Yet they also highlighted the resourcefulness, endurance, and quiet resilience of those who persevered. Victorian servants endured hunger and illness, continued to perform their duties, and maintained the smooth operation of households despite the constant physical and mental toll. Ultimately, the struggle with poor diet and sickness was more than just a challenge. It was a defining feature of life below stairs, shaping health, stamina, and the unspoken strength that allowed servants to survive and support the opulence of the world above. For many Victorian servants, life below stairs was grueling, and the path to independence seemed almost impossible. Long hours, meagre wages, strict discipline, and constant supervision left little room for personal growth or freedom. One of the few socially acceptable ways to escape these constraints was through marriage, a route that offered both stability and the hope of a life outside servitude. Marriage provided more than emotional companionship. It offered practical security. A servant who married could leave the household, establish a home, and sometimes rely on a spouse's earnings to supplement their own. In many cases, it allowed women, in particular, to step away from demanding domestic roles and into a more autonomous life. This was especially appealing for those who had spent years in service with little chance of advancement or financial independence. The decision to marry was never taken lightly. Servants had to consider not only affection and compatibility, but also the practical realities of supporting a household. Wages were low, and savings were rare. Many had to wait until they had some financial cushion, or until both partners were employed. In some cases, families intervened, encouraging matches that promised stability or advantage, rather than purely romantic considerations. Marriage also shifted social standing. While still part of the working class, a married servant had a different status than a young single maid or footman. Independence brought a measure of respect and the ability to make personal choices that were impossible under the strict hierarchy of service. It allowed former servants to build lives on their own terms, breaking away from the constant surveillance and rigid expectations of the household staff. However, marriage was not a guaranteed escape from hardship. Newlywed servants still faced economic challenges, limited opportunities, and long hours if they continued in domestic work. In some cases, Couples had to take in boarders, run small trades, or work multiple jobs to make ends meet. For women, domestic labour often continued at home, now extended to caring for a family rather than serving masters. Yet even these struggles were often preferable to the relentless control and discipline of life below stairs. Romance and companionship offered another benefit: emotional support. Long hours, strict rules, and constant labour could be isolating. Marriage provided intimacy, shared responsibility, and a sense of partnership that mitigated the loneliness inherent in servant life. Shared laughter, mutual encouragement, and small acts of kindness became anchors in a world otherwise dominated by duty and exhaustion. In some households, marriage was actively encouraged as a way to manage staff turnover. Employers sometimes preferred married couples, viewing them as stable and reliable, and they occasionally arranged introductions through social networks or church connections. For the servants themselves, this social scaffolding provided an opportunity to leave service gracefully with a measure of dignity and security. Ultimately, marriage represented one of the few avenues for Victorian servants to regain autonomy. It offered the chance to leave behind strict routines, harsh labour, and constant scrutiny, replacing them with the responsibilities and freedoms of domestic life of their own making. While not without its challenges, marriage was a beacon of hope, a way out of the relentless world below stairs, and a step toward personal freedom, stability, and the possibility of a different, self-directed life. For many Victorian servants, the exhausting and restrictive life below stairs eventually prompted thoughts of leaving domestic service altogether. While marriage was one avenue, others sought independence through employment in factories, workshops, or shops. These alternatives promised a different kind of life: more predictable hours, personal autonomy, and in some cases slightly better pay. The move to factories or shops marked a significant shift in daily routines. Unlike domestic service, where labour was continuous and dictated by the whims of masters, factory work often followed a rigid but predictable schedule. The day began and ended at set times, with regular breaks and defined roles. Shop work similarly offered structured hours, a clear chain of responsibility, and, importantly, more opportunities to interact with the wider world outside the household. Financial incentives were a major factor. While wages in factories and shops were far from generous, they were sometimes better than the meagre pay below stairs. Earnings were predictable, and the work, though often physically demanding, came without the constant surveillance and arbitrary fines imposed by household supervisors. For many, even a modest increase in income meant access to better food, clothing, and living conditions, making the risk of leaving domestic service worthwhile. Independence also brought psychological relief. Freed from the strict hierarchy of the household, former servants could make personal choices about their daily routines, work pace, and interactions. Mistakes were less likely to result in fines or immediate dismissal, reducing the constant anxiety that had dominated life below stairs. They could develop new skills, learn trades, and gain experience that would support longer-term financial stability. Yet, the transition was not without challenges. Factories and shops had their own dangers and demands. Industrial work could be exhausting, with long hours, heavy machinery, and exposure to heat, dust, or chemicals. Shop assistants faced long days on their feet, dealing with demanding customers and the pressures of sales targets. Adapting from the domestic sphere to these environments required resilience, flexibility, and a willingness to learn new routines quickly. The social shift was equally significant. Domestic service provided a close-knit, albeit hierarchical community of peers. Moving to factories or shops meant joining a more anonymous workforce, where bonds were less personal and discipline was enforced differently. Servants had to navigate new hierarchies, learn workplace norms, and establish reputations in unfamiliar settings. Despite these challenges, many former servants thrived. The move allowed them to build a degree of autonomy that was impossible in domestic service. They could plan their days, save wages, and begin to shape their own futures. Even if the work was exhausting, it offered a sense of self-determination that life below stairs rarely permitted. Ultimately, leaving domestic service for factories or shops represented a choice for control over one's life. It was an escape from the endless demands, hierarchy, and scrutiny of Victorian households, a step toward independence, financial stability, and personal dignity. For those willing to endure the new challenges, It offered the chance to redefine work, daily life, and the boundaries of freedom that had long been denied below stairs. For some Victorian servants, the limits of domestic service or local employment prompted a far more drastic solution: migration. Leaving the familiar streets and households of their hometowns, they sought a new start in distant cities, industrial centres, or even abroad. Migration promised a chance to escape the rigid hierarchy, grueling hours, and limited opportunities that had defined life below stairs. Migration could take many forms. Some moved from rural villages to burgeoning industrial towns in search of factory or shop work. Others ventured to the larger cities of Britain, where the anonymity of urban life offered freedom from the watchful eyes of masters and supervisors. A few took the ultimate leap, joining the tide of emigrants travelling to colonies or overseas destinations such as Canada, Australia, or the United States, chasing opportunities for land, employment, and personal autonomy. The decision to migrate was both courageous and fraught with uncertainty. It meant leaving behind family, friends, and familiar surroundings. Travel could be expensive and exhausting, and there were no guarantees of work or shelter at the destination. Yet for many, the promise of a fresh start outweighed the risks. Migration offered the hope of self-determination, the ability to choose employment, set routines, and build a life independently of the restrictive structures of Victorian households. The journey itself was often challenging. Long train rides, crowded ships, or endless walks were common experiences for those seeking work far from home. Servants had to navigate unfamiliar cities, locate affordable lodging, and secure employment without the safety net of a household to support them. Social skills, resourcefulness, and resilience became essential tools for survival. Small communities of fellow migrants often formed, offering advice, introductions, and companionship that eased the transition into unfamiliar surroundings. Once settled, the possibilities expanded. Employment in factories, shops, or service positions in new households allowed former servants to redefine their careers. Wages could be higher, hours more predictable, and the opportunity for advancement greater than in their previous positions. Some were able to acquire property, start families, or gain training in trades that promised long-term stability. Migration offered the rare combination of independence and opportunity that life below stairs had denied them. Emotionally, migration was transformative. Leaving behind the rigid discipline, gossip, and hierarchy of the household, individuals gained a sense of control over their lives. Even when hardships persisted, the ability to make choices about work, home, or social life was liberating. Many former servants discovered talents, ambitions, and strengths that had remained dormant under the strict demands of service. Yet migration also brought new challenges. Isolation, cultural adjustment, and unfamiliar work environments tested the courage and resilience of those who moved. Success was not guaranteed, and setbacks could be harsh. Nevertheless, for those who persevered, migration represented the ultimate opportunity to break free from the cycle of domestic service, build a life of their own design, and experience a level of independence that had been impossible below stairs. In the end, migration and a new start symbolised hope, courage, and self-determination. For Victorian servants, it was a path that transformed hardship into opportunity, offering the chance to leave behind the exhausting and hierarchical world below stairs and create a life defined by choice, dignity, and possibility.